Hello, everybody. My name is Kaylin Gilbert. So, in this presentation, we are going to do a little bit of a recap of what I have learned over 4 different field observations that I have done over the course of the semester. And we're really mostly just going to discuss some of the traits that I have found really makes a good educator, and then turn that into some tips for beginning educators to kind of help us out. Um, Entering the field of education is extremely nerve wracking. So, these are just some tips to try to help us all along the way. So, the first thing that we are going to be discussing is first of all, what makes a good educator? So, obviously, depending on who you ask, you're going to get 100 different questions from 100 different people. But I would argue that almost all of the answers that you would get from asking these questions would, in one way or another, relate to a teacher's ability to form relationships with the students and create a very comforting and encouraging environment. I know that in my personal experience of being a student as well as a teacher, and in college, I found that my favorite teachers or the favorite classes that I've student taught have been the classes where I had really good relationships with my teachers or the teachers who I could tell cared. Not only did those teachers care about academic aspects, but they also cared about my well being as an individual and as a person as well. They saw me for more than just my grades. They always did everything in their power to help me grasp difficult concepts, but they always made sure that I knew I had a trusted adult in my life. And that's going to be a major topic that we talk about later on in this presentation. Um, and a lot of this is backed up by the educational psychology textbook that we have been going over, specifically chapter 2 of the educational psychology textbook discusses the importance of understanding the challenges that can come with teaching that many people do not talk about. With that being said, we are going to start discussing some of the tips. So, the first tip that we will be talking about is to see your students as individuals. As I previously mentioned, I do feel like a lot of teachers, not all of them, do tend to view their students as academic, academic aspects rather than individual people. A lot of teachers focus on grades. Tip number 2 kind of goes with this. Don't give up on your students. That might seem like a given, but as you get into education, you will have a student here and there that really makes it difficult to not want to give up. But we'll get into that in a minute. Um, the second little blip that we will be talking about is tip number 3. Be the role model that you needed when you were a kid. Role models are a huge, important factor of being a teacher. And tip number 4, remember that you are a human being and that it is okay to make mistakes. Okay, so tip number 1, as we've previously mentioned, is see your students as individuals rather than just students. So I feel like this is one of the biggest aspects of being an educator. Um, so I really got the idea for this tip after my observation of Chloe Knox. Um, she works at a child care facility, and I was just kind of asking her, what is your pedagogy as a preschool teacher? So, essentially, what she was mostly mentioning is that her pedagogy is not one size fits all for education. She was mentioning how all of her students are in different stages academically, socially, emotionally, and this creates an environment where you can't really teach the same thing the same way for every student. If you're familiar with differentiation, if you're kind of at that point in your career, then you'll definitely really be able to relate to this idea of, fitting what each student needs. So each child is a different case in the field of education, and educators need to be able to see students as more than just students. Students are not just hand them a paper, grade the paper, and that's what they are. Students are so much more than that. We also need to start acknowledging what makes our students unique, and we need to help building healthy relationships with students. Obviously, not unhealthy, but a healthy relationship, and realizing what strengths that your students have, or like we just said, what makes them unique, can also kind of help form bonds. Um, And that can help you later on whenever you are trying to figure out, how can I get this message through to this student? Maybe try to play onto whatever they're interested in, or if they're really good at drawing, maybe they're a visual learner and whatnot. Again, know that every student is an individual with individual needs, and each student needs different accommodations. So, while I was observing Miss Knox, I noticed that she created a super nourishing environment for her students. Again, this is only preschool, but that's still a very important age developmentally. I do notice that she allows all of her students to be seen. She, really tries to give each student the individual attention that they need to really flourish and thrive in her classroom. Um, yeah, and she gives attention to all students, acknowledging what they need to thrive. So that's my first tip. As draining as this may seem, it's really not all of that. Once you get to know your students, you know what works for them and you know what doesn't. So, tip number two does kind of go along with tip number one. Tip number two is, as hard as it may seem, try your best to never give up on your students. So, I got this tip from my observation of Miss Sarah Isley. She is a third grade teacher at an elementary school, and she's also a dear friend of mine. So, when I was observing her classroom, I asked her, what do you feel like your pedagogy is? What do you feel like you need to do as a teacher to really make your students successful? So, what she says is, do not give up on your students, even when it seems impossible. So, what she means by this is kind of like what we were talking about earlier with tip number one. Every student is different. Some students grasp stuff super easy, and it takes a while for other students to grasp different concepts. She's referencing those students who do take a minute to reference different lessons or different concepts. She's essentially saying eventually something will be presented in a way that does make sense to them. And whenever that does happen, you really live for that aha moment. She can be quoted saying, as long as you don't give up on your students, chances are they won't give up on you. And that is very true. A lot of students do rely on their teachers, and if they see that their teacher is really doing everything they can to help you out, a lot of the time students will also have that readiness and that willingness to learn. Of course, that's not every case, but it does help out a lot with that. Um, and another thing that she mentioned is knowing that it is just as, or possibly more frustrating for your students whenever there is a difficult concept. I can remember multiple times in high school or even college where there was a concept that was extremely frustrating for me just to understand. So put yourself in the student perspective as well as an educator perspective. It is not easy to learn new things. Um, and her biggest thing is saying that every child can learn as long as they have a teacher that is willing to teach. So that's pretty much the big thing for tip number two. Don't give up on your students, and you need to be willing to take that extra step to make sure that they are safe and that they feel heard and seen, and you can figure out what they need to be successful. Alrighty, so we are going to go ahead and move on to tip number three. So, tip number three is, be the role model that you needed when you were a student. This is a big one, I feel like. So, I really got this idea for tip number three after my observation of Mr. Terrence Francis. He is a high school teacher as well as a football coach, so he is pretty much a pretty positive role model. Um, he mentions that he knows how important it can be to ensure students have positive role models because he did not always have positive role models growing up. So he wanted to make sure that his students have at least one. He says he really thrives to be somebody who the students can look up to. He also mentions that he realizes that there are positive as well as negative role models. He said that, negative role models can make just as much of an impact on a student's life as a positive role model can. And some students don't have a good role model at home. So it's really important for educators to try to thrive to make at least the school setting have a place where they have at least one positive role model to look up to. This also helps form positive relationships with students. So this really goes back to tip one and two, where we really talk about creating this safe environment where we see our students. Um, and really just build those relationships. Those relationships help so much as educators. They help understand the students. They also help with classroom management a lot. It helps with building relationships with parents. They're extremely important to have relationships. So, whenever it comes to being a role model, just remember your students are always watching you. They see everything you say and everything you do. And as nerve wracking as that may sound, just try your best. Strive to be somebody who you would want to look up to if you were their age. Okay, so it is now time to move on to our final tip, and that is tip number 4. So, this one builds off of tip number 3, where it talks about being a role model and how important that is. So, tip number 4 is that remember that you are a human and that it is okay to make mistakes. So, I feel like as an educator, you do realize that you are put on this not a pedestal, but a lot of students do see you as an authoritative figure or somebody to look up to. And during my observation of Ms. Z, she really brought to my attention how stressful it can be for an educator to carry this stress of knowing that you are constantly being watched. So she mentions that she's often hyper aware of her actions while she is in the classroom. So she, was aware of everything that she is doing and saying. And while this can be a good thing as an educator to make sure you don't do anything wildly inappropriate, it can definitely be stressful. And she often worries about being a positive role model for her students. But what she has to remind herself is that she is a human being. Everybody makes mistakes, and you can't beat yourself over it if you do. And a lot of the times, it's good for students to see their role models make mistakes because if they see their role model make a mistake and then address the issue and solve the issue, it can show students, one, that it's okay to not be perfect, and it can also sometimes teach them valuable problem solving skills. Um, and it's very important as an educator to not let this stress of being a positive role model impact your own mental health. We already have to be very mentally, there whenever we are in the classroom. Um, so it's important that we have a good mental health and a good mental standing. So we can't let this stress of being a role model weigh on us. So for tip number 4, just remember everybody makes mistakes and educators are no different, and that sometimes it's good to make mistakes. All right, so that has been my 4 tips for beginning educators. Tip number 1, see students as individuals. Number 2, don't give up on your students. 3, be the role model that you needed when you were a student. And 4, remember that you are also human. Being an educator is not for the faint of heart, but a few helpful tips can help educators get through the day. The best teachers see their students and form relationships with their students, and remember that it is okay to not be perfect. Many teachers just need a little extra help, and this is the goal of this presentation. So thank you for sitting through this presentation for me. Here are some references that I referenced throughout my observations. And I want to send a special thanks to all the educators who took the time out of their day to allow me to interview them and sit with them and observe their classrooms. I hope you enjoyed. Have a good day.